Hello, my friend. Welcome into another episode of a Level Deeper podcast. I'm Chad Miles. I'll be your host for this episode. Today, I'm excited to share a conversation that I had with what happens to be my first cousin, and her name is Alyssa LaHaie. I didn't want to talk to Alyssa just because we happen to be family. I wanted to chat with Alyssa because she has done something that I admire. She wrote a book. You know, one of the core tenets of the show is to build a meaningful life and explore how we do that. And one of the things that I think comes up a lot is people have a desire to create something, to put something into the world, whether it be a book or an event or a podcast or a business. I find often that people have a desire to create something, and that would make their life more meaningful. So one of the things that I enjoy exploring in the show is, well, having conversations with people who have done something like that. And in this case, Alyssa she has written her first book before the age of 30. Specifically, she's been going through this process for the last couple of years, from having a vision, starting to write it, and now she'll fill you in on how the book writing and publishing process goes, but now she's trying to get her book published. What I enjoy so much about conversations like this is that, yes, we're talking about writing books. We're talking about her experience writing her book. And yet, if you replace book with whatever it is that you might envision and want to create in your life, so many aspects of this conversation are going to be applicable to that thing. Things like how to overcome the dauntingness of getting started, how to overcome thinking about what other people might think of you as you get going, how to stay creative, how to stay motivated, how to overcome some of the roadblocks and friction and difficulty along the way. All of these things apply to whatever it is that we're creating that would make our lives meaningful. So that's why ultimately I think no matter what you're trying to create with your life, you're going to pull something from this conversation, because I know I did. Here's my conversation with Alyssa LaHaie. All right, so one of the things that I'm curious about is this idea of labels. I've talked with people on the show before. Specifically, I had Tanner Olson on, and he's a writer and a poet, and he talked about this idea of, you know, we label ourselves as like an aspiring blank, or we want to be blank. When you think of the label of author, well, first of all, how does that sound to hear me, say that or reference you that way? In when, like internally, when did you start to actually think of yourself as an author?
That's a great question. I think anyone who, I think most people in my situation would agree, there's a major case of imposter syndrome of, I don't have a published book at this point. There's also different types of publishing. You could self-publish or traditionally publish, quote unquote, through an actual publishing house. And there, within the writing world, there's a sense of, well, if you're self-published, are you really an author? And you absolutely are, 100%. But there's sometimes you get people in the publishing world that may say not so much, or have kind of a look down on that form. And then being in neither of those situations right now, it's weird to call yourself an author because it's not something that I'm doing in any professional capacity technically at this point. But you have to, I finished a book. So I did the thing. And so in my head, I guess I am an author, but it's still kind of a weird label to occupy at this point. It's like when you said it and I was like, oh, it's kind of weird still.
It's sort of funny how we're really good at finding ways to continue to, like, I don't know, I guess diminish what we have done or accomplished. It's kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, I've written a book, but it's not published, but it's not, it's like there's always some other attainable thing. I think I do it with the podcast a lot. People would be like, wow, you have a show, you're a podcaster. I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I do, but it only reaches this many people, or whatever the thing is. It seems like we limit ourselves a lot, even though by definition, you have written a book. So therefore, you are an author.
Yeah, exactly. And you have a podcast. Therefore, you are a podcaster. It's true.
So, I mean, take us back to, do you remember like the first time that you ever had the thought or dream of, I want to write a book?
Yes and no. So I remember as a kid, specifically, I had a teacher, I think it was second grade. And I don't remember the exact assignment, but I remember doing a lot of these. We would write books and we would like take cardboard, paper, colors, and you would put a certain number of like white pages in the middle and you would draw and write all these stories. And mine always went way longer than we were supposed to. And I remember doing all of those like tests we had to take, all those standardized tests where they would say, just write what you know, write about honesty and write what you know. And I was always like, absolutely not. I'm making something up. I want nothing to do with writing nonfiction, quote unquote. I want to make something up. And again, I would always go way over the limit of pages. And I always preferred playing by myself. I'm an introvert and I like playing by myself. And I had names for all of my toys. I had storylines for all of my toys. Like to this day, I could probably go back to my parents' toy closet and be like, ah, yes, this was what was going on there. And so I think I always just had that instinct to want to create characters and tell stories. And then, I got into high school and college, I would say, and writing and reading became more of a chore, a homework and a chore than it was fun. So I kind of forgot about all of that. And then I got out of college and got back into reading and found some stories that I really loved. Like Game of Thrones was something that I got really into, and other things like that really inspired me. So I just started kind of writing. Like between seasons, I would just be like, what do I want to happen next in this story? And would just kind of like write stuff. And fell in love with it. And it just became something that I would do on the weekends or whenever I had an idea. And I also, in college, actually, was finding that as I traveled, I would come up with different ideas for things. And I would create Google Docs for them, like character names. I would write some chapters or like random lines of dialogue. And then I just kind of forgot about it. And then I rolled back to it with a couple years ago and was like, oh yes, this could be something, or I can take pieces of this idea that I had and do something with it now. So I've always just I think it's always been part of me and things that I enjoyed doing, but I never really knew what that could look like until I started writing again for fun and then saw other people doing that and turning that into actually publishing books and said, okay, well, if they can do that, then I can do that too. So it's time to sit down and actually do the thing.
Hey, it's Chad here, and this is an ad for this show. I want to personally say thanks for tuning into the podcast. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for a while, it means a lot that you're here. I'm not asking you for money. Actually, I'm asking for you to take a small action to help grow the show. More specifically, there's 3 things you can do to help grow the show and spread meaningful conversations like the ones that we have here. First is to leave a rating or review for the show on the platform that you're listening on. It takes about 10 seconds and can make a big difference. Number 2 is to subscribe or follow the show on whatever platform you're listening on, just so that you make sure you get notified of each episode that's published. Lastly, number 3 is to share the episode. Whether you send a text to a friend, talk about the episode at your next book club, or make a post on social media, sharing goes a long way to help. So thanks again for listening, and thanks in advance for taking a small action to help the show. Okay, back to the episode. I'm curious about some of this relationship to writing and creating and writing creatively. You talked about like early on in your schooling life, you would have these assignments and you would just kind of interpret them your own way and be like, all right, well, I get what the assignment is, but I'm going to go write what I want to write. I'm going to create what I want to create. How was that received by teachers, by classmates? Because you mentioned then you went through this period where writing became a chore, and that sounds a lot different than what you described when you're talking about, just writing from a purely creative standpoint. So how was some of that work or creativity received early on?
Yeah, generally it was received well. I remember always doing well on those assignments. And I think like, and then on those standardized tests, the writing portion I always did pretty well on too. I think it was because writing's hard for a lot of people. And when we're taught it in school, it's very prescriptive, and it's, a paragraph is 5 sentences, a beginning, the middle, and the end. And it must be this, this, and this. And there's not a lot of room for you to play and be creative in those situations. And so the moment that you do, whether you just rebel and decide to do it on your own or whatever the case may be, I think people like teachers, if you're reading hundreds of essays, the one that's different is going to be more interesting to you probably than the ones that are all exactly what I taught you to do. And I think that's true in all writing. There's all these rules that are imposed, or people will tell you can't do X, Y, or Z. Like a big one right now is like no prologues in books. And it's like every book you've ever read has a prologue. What do you mean no prologues? But it's about doing it, quote unquote, well, and finding the way to make it different and not exactly just cookie cutter of what everyone else is doing. So for me, I have found even in my essay writing that I had to do a lot of in school, not doing exactly what they told you to do and doing something a little bit different has usually served me well.
That's always been a relationship that I've struggled with. I've tended to be someone where it's like, well, if they're asking for blank, then my job is to perform what they are asking for to the best of my abilities. Like that's in this process of, if a good grade is the ultimate outcome that we want, I've always thought about do exactly as they say to the best of your ability, and that's going to present the best outcome. But what I experienced and what happened was I lost a lot of, if I had ideas of ways to creatively go about something, well, I know that they're asking for this, but let me put this spin on it. I wouldn't do that. And that took a lot of the creativity and joy out of whether it was writing or speaking or just the different things. So tell me more about, how did you mentioned that relationship with writing and creative writing. How did it sort of come back to you?
Yeah. So like I said, I think you've witnessed this, or at least your poor brother has, that I got deep into Game of Thrones specifically. And we had the long gap between, was it seasons 7 and 8, maybe? Yeah. And I was just like devouring everything I could about it. And I was like, this is what I hope happens. And I just got ideas in my head and I started writing them down. And there's wonderful communities on the internet where you can post works, whether they're about a specific fandom that you're in, whether it's just, like The Martian, for example, that book and subsequent movie, he just posted that on a forum and people loved it. And so eventually that got published and turned into one of my favorite movies. So there's all these great forums where you can just go and post things, and you can do it anonymously, you can do it not anonymously, and you can get a lot of great feedback, and people are generally so supportive. So I kind of started there. And then that actually helped me a lot with consistency and building a routine, because then I had, anonymously, a readership that expected something from me on a semi-regular basis. And so I could kind of build that schedule and say, all right, well, I'll post once a week and I'll spend my weekends at my coffee shops writing, and whatever I get done that weekend, hopefully I finish a chapter. If I don't finish a chapter, then I miss a week. But I kind of had that at least self-imposed deadlines and timelines, and then was getting that feedback that helped me feel like, oh yeah, I can, like, people are enjoying this. I can continue doing this. You can watch yourself get better, which is nice. Like, you can go back and read it later and be like, oh man, that was rough. And, see how you got better over time as you were writing. And so that was kind of how I got back into it. It was just loving something so much that I wanted to keep telling that story, and it wasn't available to me yet. So I was filling that gap in myself and then reading other people doing the same thing.
You talked about this process of looking back at some of the things that you've written and, maybe kind of cringing or being like, oh, that wasn't my best. What was your relationship with that like? Because I think that's often people's fear. It's one of my fears is like, I don't want to start doing something out of fear that I'm going to be bad at it. So it's pretty cool to be able to publicly sort of document and then go back and look and compare. how did you sort of see some of your old writing or the things that you maybe weren't so proud of? I don't know. What was your relationship with that stuff like?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's the best thing you can do, especially when you're starting a new project like writing a book or anything similar, really, is to not read it for a while, to put some distance between you and it. One of the big problem I had when I first started writing this book that I wasn't putting anywhere, that I was just writing on my own time, was constantly going back to the things I'd already written and editing them instead of moving on and then editing at the end. And I think that kind of goes back to, I can look back now at the things I wrote and I'll reread them and I'll say, oh, that could have been better, or, whatever the case may be. But I've taken like years, like I'll finish the thing before I'll necessarily go back and do that and read it. And so then you have enough distance to kind of say, that wasn't great. I could have done that better. Or, wow, that's rife with spelling mistakes or things like that. But then there's all the other things that you kind of forgot that you did, that you're like, wow, that was really great scene, or that was really good dialogue, or that was a really fun turn of phrase. And I came up with that. And when you're stuck where you are now, I think that's kind of fun to be like, you know what? I have this in me to do something cool and to write something that I really like, at least. And so having that kind of documented to go back to say you've come a really long way, but you also have a lot of potential, and you can see kind of both of those things. But again, I definitely think distance is helpful. Give yourself some space from it before you go back to it. It's weird to listen to your own voice. It's weird to read your own writing. Just give yourself some space.
I like the idea of space. And I think it is important as creators to go back and put ourselves in the consumer seat and yes, consume the things that we have created, because like you said, it brings a whole different perspective. Sometimes you might be critical of the things that you've created. And I like how you mentioned, actually, sometimes you might be sort of impressed by the things that you've written or made. That's a cool twist on things too.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be things that you would go back and do differently. But that doesn't mean that, you shouldn't be proud of the things that you did well. There's always going to be something that you did well in there too. And I think it's important to be appropriately critical, but not detrimentally so.
So you've talked about your childhood, and at this point, I probably mentioned this in the intro, but Alyssa and I are first cousins. So I had a front row seat to her childhood, yes, and can attest to many Lego building sessions where Alyssa was kind of off on her own, just developing storylines with characters and playing those out. So or
even like when we would be at Grandma and Grandpa's and they had that massive chalkboard and like school set up in the basement. I loved that. that was my zone.
So I mean, I've kind of seen this creativity that you've had, this being this imagination that you've had, being drawn to stories. So it's not surprising to me that you decided to go about writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
Talk us through, so many people dream of doing something like writing a book. So you've kind of had this inclination to writing and creativity and storytelling. I mean, what led you from maybe one day I'd like to write a book to actually starting to do the thing?
Yeah. Well, so like I said, I'd been writing, in those different forums online, and I've written books. I've written full books in that context. Even some, like I had one lovely reader who loved it so much that she asked if she could translate it into Russian, which is like the ultimate honor of my life. Honestly, no matter what else happens with my writing journey, like that was such a huge honor that she would take the time to do that. And so I was really enjoying that. And it was something I was doing for fun that I loved. And then I was watching other people whose writing I was reading and really loved go on to publish books, whether it was an edited version of the thing that I originally loved or something totally original and unique. And I was watching them have so much success with that. And I just thought, I have all these story ideas that I've come up with throughout the years, that I have all these Google Docs. I've got character names, I've got ideas, I've got all this stuff. Why don't I just sit down and actually do something with this? This is actually like my own world that I've made up. So why don't I sit down and try? It can't hurt to try, basically. I was already kind of in that mode, at least before COVID, of spending any weekend that I wasn't traveling or, doing something else around town that I was kind of free. I would go to my coffee shops or the library or, the bookstore, wherever I could go and write, and I would write. And so I just kind of thought, well, I'm doing all of this for free. Why don't I try and do it for real and maybe make some money off of it someday? So that was kind of where I finally just sat down and said, all right, why don't you give this a go? And that was probably December 2022, I think, is when I sat down and just said, you have this idea, you have all of these things kind of already started. Let's do it. It's the end of the year. You're kind of looking forward to what is 2023 going to look like. And I just said, all right, you have 2023 to write this book. The first draft of it. It doesn't, have to be perfect and finished and everything, but you have 2023 to finish the draft of the book that could be read in totality. And so that's what I set off to do. And I, have a full-time job. I actually switched jobs in the middle of 2023. So it wasn't like I was writing every day. I think most people would tell you, write every day. I can't. I would love to. It's not possible for me to do that. And so you carve out the time when you can. For me, it was mostly weekends. Sometimes I was able to do it during the week, kind of depending on how busy work was. I've also found that I can't write at home because I work from home. So being at home it's both a place where I relax and it's a place where I work, but I cannot write and be as creative as I would like to be in that same space. And so I have to leave my home to write, pretty much. I can edit at home. There's certain things I can do, but in general, I have to be elsewhere. I actually come up with my best ideas while driving or on airplanes, which is not the most convenient thing in the world, but is reality.
Guess it means you have to do a lot of travel.
Yes, which I do. So that's okay. Yeah, a lot of voice notes as I'm driving, trying to not forget dialogue that I come up with. But so I sat down and said I had given myself a year, said I was going to do it. And I ended up finishing in October. So a couple months earlier than I, had given myself. And that was with starting over, scrapping it a couple times. Really just, I gave myself a word count that I wanted to reach and I cranked it out. And when I hit October, I had friends coming into town. I knew I was heading into a really busy travel holiday end of the year situation. And so I said, I had written the end and I had written a good chunk of the book and I had, 20,000 words left, let's say. And I just said, all right, you got 2 weeks. If this isn't done before your friends come into town, it's probably not going to happen. And I just cranked it out for those 2 weeks because I'm the kind of person who works really well under a deadline. And in a situation like this, where I don't have an agent, I don't have a publishing deal, I don't have anyone telling me you must have this thing done by XY date, I had to self-impose all of those deadlines. So I'd given myself a reasonable, I hope, deadline. I mean, it ended up being reasonable, of the year. And then within that, had to give myself kind of smaller deadlines where I would even say, you have to write 2 chapters this week. And I know what a chapter length is for me, so I know how many days that usually takes. And so you kind of had to plan that out. And if you didn't hit it, you didn't hit it. It was good. I had a friend who would hold me accountable if I asked her to. And I'd be like, you need to check with me on Monday. And just the fact that I knew she would ask me if I finished it usually helped me to finish it because I didn't want to have to tell her no. And she didn't care. She's like, if you finish it, great. If you don't, you don't. But for me, that was a helpful just check to have coming, that I knew I didn't want to have to tell someone that I didn't succeed where I said I was going to. So that was all. That's been very helpful, is kind of figuring out ways to self-impose deadlines and figuring out what you need. I think this is true for whether it's an exercise routine or diet or creating something, all of those things, anything that requires you to develop a routine, you have to take an honest stock of what works for you and what doesn't work for you and push yourself. Because the fact is, you're changing your routine, so it's not going to be comfortable no matter what you do, but you have to figure out what does work for you and find ways and people and, whatever the case may be, to impose if whether it's deadlines or whatever you need to make sure that you're going to be able to get that thing done when you say that you're going to.
So you mentioned like the example of the friend who served as sort of your accountability partner through some of this process. I mean, how much were you communicating outwardly or publicly that you were starting to write this book and you were taking on this project? Because again, I think that's one of the common sort of fears that people have is like, well, if I go start working on this new thing, like people might see me differently. They've never seen me as, or they don't know me as a writer or an author. And that can bring in a lot of fear. So what approach did you sort of take to publicly sharing about this process?
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't tell very many people for a long time. I think I had a few friends I told. I had two friends in particular who were with me through the whole thing. They've read every iteration version of it to the point where now they're like, wait, what version are we on? What's actually happening? I don't remember from, version 1 to version 6, what I read. But in general, I kept it pretty close to the vest. And I've kept my writing pretty close to the vest for a long time. And only recently, I would say, over the last year, started opening up about that more. And it wasn't really until I got pretty much close to being done, if not after I finished that first draft, that I started kind of telling people more broadly that that's what I'd been doing and that's what I was hoping to do. Honestly, I that's been scary and weird, and everyone's been so wonderful and supportive, and my family and friends have been so great about reading and giving me feedback and being very supportive and asking questions. But it is a strange thing, especially because specifically the writing process, but I think this is probably true in a lot of creative endeavors. It's a very long process. And so once you tell someone you're doing something, the next time they see you, they want to know what's going on. And oftentimes there's just nothing going on. There's no update. You're kind of sitting on something, or you're editing something, or like you're just putting space between you and that thing so you can look at it with fresh eyes down the line. And so there isn't always an update. And then that's kind of a weird thing where you feel like you're failing in some way because you don't have an update, and it's been 6 months since you last asked me. But I'm trying to learn to be patient. I can put deadlines on things that I have control over, which is, am I writing? I can't put deadlines on things that are out of my control, which is how quickly an agent might read a query that I sent in, which is, for those who aren't in the writing trenches, basically a job application that you send to agents who would represent you to publishing houses. So it's like you have to write basically the equivalent of a cover letter for your book. And anyone who's applied for jobs recently knows you have to customize all your cover letters. And so every time you're sending one out, you have to change things up, and you got to make sure that everything is perfect. And then you're just kind of hoping that someone gets back to you. And most of the time they don't get back to you for 90 days or more. And usually it's with rejection at that point. So it's just a waiting game. It's very long. And then once you get an agent, then you're prepping to submit to publishers. And then there's a lot of rejection there. So your dream can die before you get an agent. It can die after you get an agent. There's many places it can die. And then if it doesn't die, if it lives and you do get a deal, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 years before it's actually published on the shelves, just because all these publishing houses have these backlogs. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. But once you started telling people about it, you start to feel like you want it to be a sprint, and then it's hard to be patient about it. So it's been a slow roll. I think, to get back to your actual question, it's been a slow roll. Now most people, if not everybody, pretty much in my life knows that I'm working on this and it's something that I'm doing, but it's still something that's kind of strange to talk about. This is definitely the most that I think I've talked about it.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think it's cool. Do you have, what is your definition of success as it relates to this book in your journey as an author? And how has it maybe shifted or changed over time?
Yeah, I think like everybody's dream is, to write a book that's going to be the next HBO show. And I think so I now have multiple levels of a dream. If my dream is a bookshelf, that's like the above the bookshelf dream. Reasonably, my dream is to get an agent and to get a publishing deal and to publish the 3 books in this series that I have planned. That's the attainable dream, I guess I would say. Beyond that, I would love to be able to make writing, if not my full-time job, at least a consistent, I don't know, maybe more than a side hustle, but, a second stream of income. Right thus far, I have been able to manage working full-time and writing. And as long as that's possible, I like the security of having the full-time job. I think it's very brave of people to quit their job to pursue a creative endeavor full-time, but that's too scary for me. I like to have more security than that. So I think I would love for it to be a career that I build. And then if, the next tier up from that would to be so successful that you can quit your job and you're doing so well as a writer. But I think, I would hate to see something that I genuinely enjoy and love doing turn into a chore again and have that be something that the business side of it makes me fall out of love with the creative side of it. And I think that's a fact with any creative, whether you're a painter, writer, podcaster. Lord knows the entertainment industry is a disaster right now. And so much, you love doing the creative part of it, but the second it turns into a business, it's a whole different thing. And your business brain is completely different than your creative brain, and merging those two things can be scary and terrible in certain situations. And so wanting to be honest with myself about the moment that it no longer becomes fun and something that I'm enjoying doing, having an honest, reflection and conversation with myself about that is it worth it at that point? So I'd love to see my work someday be translated into screen, because I'm a big movie and TV buff. And so that would be really exciting. But reasonably just want to publish this trilogy someday.
That relationship to creating and creativity, especially when we try to apply the lens of like turning it into a business or turning some kind of hobby or passion or fun thing that we do into something that creates money for us and creates an income for us. I mean, have you noticed any shift in the relationship that you have with writing when all of a sudden you set out to say, I want to write a book, I want this to get published, and my goal or intention is that this is going to become at least something that provides me some level of income? Have you noticed any shifts?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think the best books or the best art in general is personal. And it's at the end of the day, if you don't love what you're working on and it doesn't speak to you, then I mean, what are you doing? You've got to love it too. But for me, knowing that I want to publish and want this to be theoretically, a commercial book, quote unquote, commercial series, I have to keep in mind what's popular, what the tropes are, what things do you kind of have to have in the book, what things are maybe too much. Like I had the opening chapter was a lot more violent originally, and I kind of toned that down. And so you are kind of keeping some of those decisions in mind, even as you're just trying to write the story that you want to tell, I think. And then that from the beginning. And then once you get past that, once you've got the draft and you're thinking about trying to get an agent and to publish it, that's the whole different mindset. And so then I'm, worried about social media, not just producing it, but reading what everyone else is going through and everybody's different opinions, and everybody has different opinions, but you see all these things and you're like, well, is a prologue actually bad? Should I not pitch my book as a series? Like all these things that you hear that make you doubt yourself. And when you're just writing, you can kind of put yourself away from that if you want to, and lock yourself, quote unquote, in a room, and just do the thing. But then when you're starting to think of it as a business, you're stuck viewing it as a business. And there's also the idea that you have to take what is, let's say, 100,000 word book. That's maybe average for a fantasy book, a pretty big book. And you have to figure out a way to nail down 2 sentences to describe and to summarize that book, to pitch it, like an elevator pitch. And that's a really hard thing to do because it's a completely different part of your brain to creatively tell a long form story and then to elevator pitch it. Those 2 things are kind of antithetical in a lot of ways. And you have to do that. And you have to take it and figure out how to pitch it and how to sell it and what other books are comps to that story. So where would you fall on a bookshelf in a bookstore? That's probably true with podcasting to a certain extent too, that you have to figure out what genre am I in? What category do I fall in? What do I want to be labeled as? Going back to labels, you have to figure all those things out. And so, and you want to be, you may think that you want to create something wholly new and unique, but you really don't if you want to sell it, because you have to be able to say, well, if you liked this and this, you'll like this. So there has to be, it's tough to be the first to do something. One fact I saw recently that was, true, if discouraging, is that usually the first person to do something isn't the one that makes it big on that thing, especially in like genre writing. But I think that's true in like, think about like superhero movies. Was Marvel the first to do superhero movies? Certainly not. But they were the ones that hit it just right and, made it big. And now everyone else is chasing after that same format, that same style. The same thing is true in books. You had the vampire, all the vampire books there back probably a decade ago now. And, was Twilight the first? Certainly not. But was Twilight the biggest? Probably, and that's, you kind of have to hit it at the right time. So much of, I think, any creative endeavor, but certainly writing it is about talent and it is about hard work, but so much of it is luck too. And hitting things at just the right time and, whatever the case may be. So it's just part of the struggle for me is being reasonable about what I expect. And again, being patient. I'm not an inherently patient person, but trying to be patient and trying to really absorb all the information that I can to make sure I'm putting myself and my story and my characters in the best position to succeed, however long that takes. And I think I'm in a good position to be able to do that because it isn't something I'm trying to make my income and my livelihood. So for those people who that is what they're trying to do for a livelihood, a creative endeavor, that's a different story. But for those of us who can kind of do it on the side, whatever it is, I think it's important to be patient and make sure that you're setting yourself and your art up to succeed and getting as much feedback as you can and learning as much as you can before you just try and throw it out in the world and hope.
So I'm curious about how you toe the line between writing something that is fun for you, is inspiring for you, keeps you motivated to keep going, versus writing something that you think or believe, makes good business sense and that it's going to be something that is going to appeal to a mass audience. How did you go about finding the balance between some of your personal goals and inspiration versus the business side of things and what you think people might want?
I think the good news for me was that I tend to read commercial fiction. So I like what's popular and I like what's selling. So that's helpful when you're kind of already in that bucket to a certain extent. So that was a good starting place. For me, it was like little things. Like, I know I'm trying to write a trilogy. It is romantic fantasy. So for me, what I like personally as a reader is I don't like it when people jump right into the romance right away, that there's no kind of buildup of a relationship. So I kind of like it if in the first book, there isn't that necessarily a whole lot of romance. And then it kind of heats up as the series goes on, or, it makes more sense. I prefer that because that's what I like to read. And that's what I like in my personal relationships in life, I just think it's more important to build that kind of relationship up, but not everyone likes that. And so that's been something I've had to consider, is how much do I want to write this story the way that I believe it should be written and that I want it to be written, versus do I have to have a certain amount of that in the first book so that it can be sold that way. That's really the only thing for my story that I've had to kind of question is, are there certain things that I have to have in this book, or I can't market it the way that I would otherwise want to? And so then you just have to make those choices. And I've had to make some of them. I don't feel like any of the choices I've made have fundamentally changed the story that I wanted to tell. They just weren't necessarily the way I wrote it first. And then I've kind of gone back and said, okay, fine. Like that seems like a pretty easy, benign way to hit the market, I guess you could say. So just kind of adding things there. But I think for me, I found that writing the first draft the way I wanted it was the best thing to do. Not to get too caught up in what do I think other people want, and just writing what I wanted. And then you can go back and say, well, maybe it should be better if it's this. Or I had what they're called beta readers, but I had my friends and family read it and answer a certain set of questions I asked of them about how they felt about, did they get bored anywhere? What characters did you like or not like? And I got some really good feedback about, some characters that did some things and then they couldn't understand why anyone would root for this character if X, Y, or Z. And I was like, that's valid feedback. So I will change that. I didn't find that any of the feedback I got was anything that surprised me, I guess is what you'd say. I think for most people, it's easy, especially in writing. But again, I think this is true in any artistic endeavor. It's easy it's your thing, so you think it's good, maybe until you go back and actually read it. But you think that you're doing things well, or you're communicating things because it's all in your head. And so you think that you've got what you are trying to communicate out. And you need those additional voices to kind of tell you if that's true or not. But at the end of the day, you probably already in the back of your mind know where the weak spots are, if something wasn't hitting, because so much of the time you're kind of forcing yourself through parts that you might be feeling you're stuck or you don't love, or, whatever the case may be. And often that's when you get your feedback on and you're like, yes, you're right. I just needed you to tell me that so that I know for sure and now can go fix it.
What about some of the rejection that you've had to face that's part of this process of, okay, you've written this book. I mean, I've got to imagine it's a book that you're proud of, that, this is the first one that you have written and completed, and now you're going through this publishing process that you've outlined, and part of that is you've got to pitch it, and people are saying no to it. I've got to imagine maybe fairly often. How's that been?
Definitely. I think because a few things. It is a ton of rejection in publishing and in writing books. I knew that going in. And I think that was the biggest thing, is to know that you're going to be rejected far more times than you're going to be accepted. That's not even the right word, but that you aren't going to be rejected, basically. And so if you know that going in and you kind of prepare yourself for that, you can not take it so personally when it happens. At the end of the day, it's a form rejection email that you're getting most of the time. So it's not a personal thing. It's a lot. And I also had been applying for jobs last year, so I'd kind of just gone through a very similar process. So, for anyone that's gone through applying for jobs, it's the exact same thing. You are basically submitting a bunch of stuff online. Everybody wants something slightly different. You have to personalize everything. So you feel like you're taking this time to put something together for everyone. And then these agents are going through hundreds upon hundreds of query letters or cover letters every day. And if you aren't, really speaking to them and you don't have something that's really jumping out, you just go, you're getting a rejection, and that's fair. Like, I can't really blame them for that. It's hard, I think, to know it'd be nice to get more feedback because you don't really know what it is. Is it just a matter of taste? Is it that your package is not where it needs to be? It could be anything and you don't really know. And that I think is harder. I'm okay with getting rejected. I would love to know why. I think just because then that helps you to not get rejected the next time. So I think the bigger part for me, because I went in prepared for the rejection, has been easier. Every one gets easier. The first one sucked. there's no way around that. The first one was tough, but everyone after that has gotten a lot easier. But it does sort of stop you from wanting to keep going, in the sense that I sent out my original round of queries to a group of agents that were newer. And so my kind of thought process behind that was, well, if they don't have as many clients already, they maybe don't have as much work as a result of that that's keeping them from reading queries. So in theory, they may get back to me faster. And that was what I was more interested in, was just getting feedback. And whether that feedback was just, no, we don't like this, you need to keep working on this, basically, or more than that, if I was lucky. And that was valuable feedback for me. But what I'm now in a position to do is I have the agents I really want to work with, and I'm terrified to actually send stuff out to them, because once you get rejected, you're done. So now it's that balance of like, I have got to make sure my stuff is really perfect before I'm willing to send it out to the people that I really, really want to work with, because I only get one shot. And I think that's the scarier part. More than the rejection broadly is the being rejected by the people that you really, really want to work with. And luckily I haven't had that happen yet, but I also haven't put myself in a position to have that happen yet. So we shall see.
How does the done is better than perfect saying sort of fit into all of this?
Yeah.
And what's your relationship to that? I mean, when you talk about sending it out to some of these agents that would be like your ideal agents, when is it perfect?
Yeah, that's a great question.
How do you do that?
I think that phrase is absolutely right for the act of creating. If it is in your head and it is not on a page, that is not helpful. You can't do anything with that. You can't fix what you don't have. You can only edit what is there, and you can only iterate on what is there. So I think for the creative act, that quote is dead on. For what comes next, it's a little scarier. I think for me, I will know that it's quote unquote perfect once I get a request for someone that wants to read the full manuscript. So there's kind of measures. You send out a query, you can get rejected on a query. You then, if someone wants to read the full manuscript, they'll ask for a full, and then you can get rejected on a full, or they can offer to represent you. So for me, I'm looking for a full request, and that will tell me that my query is where I want it to be to send out to other agents. And then if they reject me, that's a matter of taste, and that is what it is. But I've got to make sure that I've got the formatting and the query and what I'm trying to say where I want it to be. And that's tough. That's where I think in any creative endeavor that you're trying to turn into a business, there is a level of investment that you probably have to make up front. In the writing world, that is hiring someone to edit your book. And that's very expensive. A book of my length can run anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 to be edited. And that's without me knowing that I'm going to see a penny back someday. So there's kind of an upfront. So you have to kind of decide, how much of that can I do myself? How much do I think I actually need someone? There's different types of editing. So there's, developmental, which is like a full manuscript rewrite. And then there's more like spelling and grammar and things like that. So depending on what you need, it costs more or less, but you have to decide what you think you need. And then I think the scariest piece of advice you get is, everything has to be perfect before you submit it. But how do you know? How do you know something's
right,
perfect?
Exactly.
It's your baby. And so you have blinders on, and you've spent so much time and invested so much time and money and energy into this thing. And it's impossible to really know. And I'm so grateful for all my friends and family that have read and given me feedback, but they're my friends and family. And at the end of the day, like, as much as I love them and I do trust them, I can't fully trust them because they're not industry people, and they're not the people that, you know, are going to shepherd this through someday. And so at a certain point, I have had to make the decision of, okay, it's probably worth getting a set of actual professional eyes on this, or submitting to contests, or just getting your stuff out there free where possible. But in certain cases, you may have to pay for some things to get objective eyes on it, because your friends and family will support you, you know, hopefully no matter what. And that is invaluable, but you've also got to make sure that they're not just loving on you because that's what they're supposed to do.
Hopefully.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I find all of this just fascinating. It's interesting hearing about, you know, there's so many parallels to podcasting and whatever we're creating, but ultimately it's just interesting hearing about some of the nuance to different situations, and especially when it comes to writing books and becoming an author. As we start to land the plane, you know, one of the conversations or things I'm curious about is creativity, and how you go about maintaining creativity and fueling some of your creativity. What does that look like for you?
It is a journey. I think it's, you know, it ebbs and flows. Some days you just are really, things are hitting. I'm laying in bed at night trying to go to sleep, and I'm just, ideas are hitting, and you're staying up till 2 a.m. Just every time you put your phone down or your computer down, you're like, roll over and you're like, nope, new idea, come back to it. And then other times I will pay for breakfast and coffee, and I will sit at a coffee shop for 3 hours, and I will write 5 words. And there's just nothing is flowing. Nothing is coming to me. And I think that's natural. I think that's okay. I do think having goals and setting goals. So if I go to a coffee shop and I'm paying for breakfast, and that's my investment in that writing time for the day, I try and tell myself that I have to write at least 500 words before I leave. That's the only way to have made that time worth it. You know, sometimes I'm deleting things and then writing, and so it doesn't necessarily net out to 500 words, but that's my goal for myself. And I think most people would say, if you can write every day, do so. If you can't, you've got to make up for that some other way. So 500 words being the minimum of what I've got to do. And if I'm only writing on the weekends, I got to crank out a lot more than that reasonably. And so knowing that, forcing yourself to just write, to just create, sometimes it's not going to be your best day. But like I said earlier, you can only edit what you've got. So it can be complete trash, but you can work with that. You can't work with a blank page. You can't work with no recordings. You can't work with no images. I find I'm very inspired by traveling. I'm very inspired by going to new places. I tend to come up with ideas while I'm going for walks, or if I'm swimming is something that I often find, because you're in your head a lot. Maybe it's running for some people, like any kind of exercise where you're getting your endorphins up, but you're also kind of alone with yourself. I think can be a really good place to come up with things creatively, but kind of just figuring out what works for you, whether it's a physical space that you're trying to create in. Like, I know I can't do it at home, and so I don't stay at home. Figuring out what works for you, and it's not always going to work, and just then don't beat yourself up when it doesn't, because I think it's natural that creativity ebbs and flows, but you've also got to, you can't fully follow that creative ebb and flow. You also have to push yourself beyond that when it's not totally working. Really enjoy it when it is, and soak that up for all it's worth. But then also make sure you have in place those guardrails and those accountability partners to make sure that you're still doing something productive in those times when it's maybe not coming to you as easily as you would hope.
Yeah, I've often reflected on what creativity is. And it's like, is creativity, is it an action or is it a result? Is it something that, do we just get this inspiration and we're going to go create? And then from my experience, like sometimes that happens. Sometimes you just get this spark and you're like, wow, I'm going to go create and do something. But it seems like if we're waiting for that to always be the case for us to create, then we're missing the opportunity. Like you said, you can't work with a blank page. So if you're just waiting for that to always be the case, then the amount that we can output or create is going to be a lot less if we're waiting for some grand spark of creativity.
Yeah, I feel like there's a concise way to say this, but I do feel like creativity is a spark. Creativity is a moment in time, a state of being maybe, but it's never going to stay. And the best way to be a creator, the best way to make sure that you're getting things done is not to rely on that creativity, but to rely on your processes and your work ethic and your accountability, and to make sure that your creative endeavor is something that you're doing as much as humanly possible, and you're not relying on that spark or that ebb in that moment in time, because then it is just an idea in a Google Doc that you wrote about while you were studying abroad in Florence and forgot about for 6 years until you came back to it. And, then it required me to actually sit down and say, okay, do this thing. And that required hard work, not creativity. So take that spark and then work hard on that spark.
I love that. Okay, we've talked a lot about the process of the book and a lot of the behind the scenes. I mean, as we wrap up here, to whatever level you are comfortable with, give us a little bit about the book itself, and if people wanted to learn more about it and this process and follow you, what might be some ways they could do that?
Yes. So I have an Instagram account, a writer's Instagram account, and it's at @LaHaie_writes. I don't post super regularly at this point. My plan is basically to keep working on getting an agent and a publishing deal, and then I'll start doing a lot more marketing. I don't love talking about the details of the book yet, because when you get a publishing deal or even when you get an agent, there's so much that can change still. I mean, even the title can change. And so it's kind of too soon, I feel like, because I don't want to start spreading the news of something that's not going to be that thing necessarily at the end. But would love to have people follow along on that journey as it happens. And we'll be posting any updates on that Instagram account.
Awesome. I'll make sure to link that in the show notes of this episode. I mean, it's cool to be along for the journey and in some ways get kind of a behind the scenes view of what the whole process looks like before it is a finalized product. And I've got to imagine for you, this is a way to sort of document, and hopefully in a few years we can look back on this conversation and say, wow, remember this version of the book and what it came to be and become. And I think that'll be fun to watch. So I encourage anyone listening to follow Alyssa, and you can just kind of see what unfolds for the rest of this journey. But thank you for being willing to share it with me and for everyone listening, because as I said to you in the beginning, I think it's just meaningful to see someone taking a dream and applying themselves to it and actually doing it. And you might have your own definition of success, but from my vantage point, the fact that you had this idea, you acted on it, you have written a book, you have a finished, completed work.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. And I have a lot of respect for you for going down this journey. So I want you to know that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you talking to me about it. It's been such an honor watching you and your wife, Eileen, do the same thing, if differently, with committing to doing the van and traveling the world and now staying in Alaska for the winter, watching you all decide to do something and committing to it and doing all that hard work it's not different at the end of the day. My journey has been with the book, but anything you choose to do, learning a new sport, building a van, whatever the case may be, I think all those life lessons are kind of the same. You just have to apply them to whatever part of your life you want to apply them to.
Yeah, I think it's been my experience. It's like in these conversations, we can remove the word book and you can replace it with whatever it is that you're trying to do in life. And all of these principles and concepts are probably going to still apply.
Yep. Yes, they are. And I think for me, the key is you can apply them all for, going exercising every day too. You've got to love the thing that you have committed to, though. I think that at the core is one of my bigger takeaways is if you don't love it, it'll be hard to do the hard work. So trying to find whatever that may be as well.
Alyssa, thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Chad.
Hey there, and thanks for tuning in to this week's conversation. Hope you took something valuable and meaningful from it. Each time I sit down with someone and just talk about what it is that they're doing in life and what they're creating or seeking to create and how they're navigating these things, I find that I pull something meaningful that I can apply to my own life, and I hope that's been your experience too. If it has been, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute just to leave a quick rating or review for the show. Whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple or another app, a quick 5-star review means a lot to help us grow the show. All right, that's it for this week, and we'll see you next time.